Prospective Hire, Part 2. Enough bodies left to operate that fucking plant. Fate must have known it too, in its tendrils, in its rhythmic ticking. It knew, or it wouldn't have called your name so softly. That's the thing people don't get. They call your MO unethical, in those instances at least where they even pretend to believe your stories. Like all you bring is cheap catharsis and death, but you don't bring death. The death was already in Kultuk, plainly infestation-like. What you're doing is no more than pressing fast forward, burning through the rot and the rut and out the other side. You've never been good with tension after all, got a visceral distaste for how it tars up the neurons to a sticky, unnavigable mess of clogged pathways and tingles at the base of your skull. Anytime you've tried to read a book or watch a movie, you've skipped to the end a tenth of the way through because it was so unbearable. Resolution, you say. That's all that matters to you, regardless of what the path entails. There's something divinely satisfying about opening a pressure valve or cutting through a stretched-out rubber band, and even the ancients knew that ash is a wonderful fertilizer in the right circumstances. The whole area had been going through rebuilding efforts since that little civil war you started died down. People are moving back in. The ecosystem is recovering. But you're skipping ahead. He probably wants to know about that Chinese guy you shot. Nope, you won't try to deny it. His name was Lee something or other, according to what the media later reported, but you didn't know it at the time. For all you could tell, he was just an Asian man in a suit, not equipped with any signs he'd be affiliated with the plant beyond that. But it's the way your strings were pulling you then. The evening was unsurprisingly cold, Siberia cold, where you can feel the layer of moisture on your eyes freezing if you leave them open for too long, and you had just lost a horse. The one left over from your voyage through the steppes. You were looking to sell it since you arrived, hadn't you mentioned? That's how you met Andrei, first fuck curious enough to find out what the deal was with this unkempt foreigner on a horse. Not that he wanted it, even if he had the money, but he offered you a shower and a tour through what little Kultuk had in terms of sights. Both of which you accepted. You meant that maybe you should have mentioned how all of this happened over the course of a day, which Liam seems to make a note of, but doesn't further comment upon. Only after you were clean and acquainted with the environs did Andrei suggest he might know some folks stupid enough to buy a horse after a bottle or two of vodka, and he ended up being mostly correct. They were an institution in what passed for a town centre in Kultuk, a yet living clump of booze, games and camaraderie, and that evening was no different. Astoundingly welcoming of your presence too, be that because their friend could vouch for you, or because you were a weirdo with stories and a Mongolian workhorse. Two qualities drunks tend to universally appreciate. Not to toot your own horn, but you certainly made good use of both these assets along the flow of talk and spirit, though in the end it was your clarity of mind which you overestimated. The horse was lost over a game of Durak. You never should have agreed to. To Fedor, you think, but he then swiftly lost it to someone else and so on, which you guess serves you right. It's in the spirit of the game. Durak does mean fool, after all, but none of the equine loss stopped you from having a good evening, especially since you didn't have to pay for any of the vodka. They just kept handing it to you, which is nice, even if it wasn't worth a horse. I guess that catches us back up, you tell your interviewer. At least, you hope so. It's all the context you can offer for why you stood plastered and horseless in a bumfuck nowhere Siberian town when a Chinese businessman walked by. You felt your strings being pulled, and by that time you had heard and seen enough of the place to know why, which is a luxury you aren't always afforded. You weren't gonna resist them. Usually when folks say that the universe guided their hand, it's more a matter of speech than anything else, but this time it really must have. Fuck knows you were too wasted to hit the frozen ground beneath your own feet if you tried, but whatever it is that pulls you had no trouble pulling the trigger either. The man fell, and then it was very briefly quiet. You ask Liam if he knows that Trotsky quote, "Revolution is impossible until it's inevitable." You don't much care about politics, and you're pretty sure this wasn't a revolution, but it's the sentiment that counts. The momentary silence that gives way to cheers and screaming, that's the sound of the switch. You're goddamn certain of it. That's impossibility flipping into inevitability and exploding around you. 2 hours in, the bottling plant was burning and Kultuk was in full pandemonium. That's what you call the first stage of civil war, when everything is incredibly fast and incredibly decentralized. No one knows what's going on, but they know it's big, so they do something until a leader or at least a charismatic speaker emerges. There's no right or wrong in those moments. Whether what you do will be celebrated or condemned later when some fuck moves into a position to forge the narrative is up to chance, so everyone just acts on undiluted adrenaline while the chaos roars around them. Phone lines did just as much to spread the unrest as the enormous 21st century smoke signal they had made, and soon Kola reached Irkutsk, where it would find its organizers and media people to spin the demands into coherence. From there, all of Eastern Russia was in active revolt within weeks. The calls were for economic aid first and foremost, but also for protection of local cultures, for more localized governance, and, unspoken, of course, for someone outside the region to finally give a shit. We'll see how the first few pan out in the long run, but the latter has certainly been accomplished. Quite the tale. Well, do you believe it? Oh, certainly. But tell me, Mr. Ashford, this thing that is pulling you, and I imagine you have avoided terms like God or such on purpose, do you think it is only acting on you specifically? What do you mean? There's video of you, yes, in all of those places. American intelligence interrogated you twice, and you seem to make no secrets of the crimes you have committed. So, how are you here? You want to hand me over to the States? Not at all. The Ruston Autonomous Region has neither part nor interest in international politics. We are the Enclave, and bringing you here was risky enough as is. So, no. I'm simply asking about your explanation for why you're still free. You've thought about that. Of course you have. It's not like you're so delusional as to take luck like this for granted. Your first experience with the impulse is what got you interrogated, you tell him. Absolutely thought you were fucked for life. Hell, you thought you were fucked for eternity back then, since you were still at least vestigially religious. When the man you assumed to be an agent entered your cramped, white-walled holding chamber, you didn't even try to hide anything. Maybe honesty could save some fraction of your soul, you thought. Worth a shot, at least. But the interrogator smilingly interrupted only a few sentences in. In truth, you learned he was a politician, and a particularly corrupt one at that. Not only had he profited from the conflict, he stood to gain even more from the uncertainty that a lack of suspects tends to foster. Your ass just sat and listened while he explained it. Maybe that man too was trying to save a sliver of his essence by laying it all out for you. You doubt it, but it's possible. In all likelihood, he was just a massive piece of shit who enjoyed the sound of his own voice too much. But who can really tell? Either way, he opened the door and let you go. He let you go, and your pulling persisted. Every once in a while, it'd rear its head, and you'd be at the center of pandemonium again. Mostly you just slipped through the cracks, but if not, the person in charge would always have a convenient reason to let you go. So you stopped questioning it, stopped worrying. Pull's pretty weak nowadays. You could resist it if you wanted to, but you sensed that if you did, the consequences would start to come due, one by one, till its deluge. Of course you don't know that, but you know it. You're covered to the neck in fate's detritus. There is no other place for you to go, and you don't want one. You like this job. Covered. Covered in blood and shit. Can't wash that off, you say. It's like borders. Doesn't go away if you dig up the dirt where it's drawn. Doesn't go away if you dig to the core of the earth. It's all blood all the way down, always. Borders shift, they say, but they're wrong. We only make new ones. border stays for as long as people remember where it used to be has an effect on how folks treat the space. It's drawn in their minds more than on paper, and you can't get rid of that unless you blow out the brains of every last border head, and even that's not enough. People then ask why all those suckers died, and soon enough, they'll learn about the old border. Shit bubbles up from inside itself. Tar-like. Death-like. Demonic, you want to say, but you don't believe in demons anymore. You believe in borders. In blood and borders. The shit on your boots. I see. Good. Now you're gonna tell me why I'm here? Yes, of course. Without going into too much detail, I can say that we are quite familiar with the craft of tapping into social feedback loops and redirecting the energy trapped therein. That's how KCDI created this little bubble, politically speaking. Back in the day, we dealt in simple coincidence engineering, breadcrumbing, pseudo-turbulence, network psychology, but, well, these sorts of projects tend to get more and more ambitious after a point. For now, we call it escalative telodynamics, though that's only a placeholder until it invents a name for itself. Consider us the more potent, synthetic analog of your trade, if you will. Not quite accurate, but it scrapes the core. A cybernetic actuator is what we'd call you, someone naturally attuned to these types of mass social convergencies. You feel the slight tugging of a string, less insistent than usual, more like an offer. Maybe these fuckers don't know so much after all. There's this quaint little sci-fi story by Kalachek. Perhaps you've heard of it? Well, I suppose you wouldn't have. It's about a man who goes into a doctor's office to get his brain upgraded with an external processor unit. They take off half of his skull, chuck the tech in, and close him up before turning it on. Now, all goes normal for a while. The man answers various calibration questions in his mind until he gets this feeling, very slowly, very scraping, that the unit is altering him, that's taking over instead of the other way round, and every time he stops thinking for a bit, he feels like the program overrides him a little. He panics, he claws at his scalp and tries desperately to continue thinking, because he has become convinced that the moment he stops, he will be gone forever. The schizophrenic battle goes on for a few paragraphs of partially corrupted text, so it's fair to say that his effort is valiant, hopping from one train of frantic psychosis to the next until reaching the neurobiological limit of human anatomy. There's a pause, a Kleistian dash that obscures its own existence, and after the pause, everything is finished. The man gets up from his hospital bed, and the doctor is smiling at him. But he doesn't smile back. He feels normal, but that could just as easily be the program's doing. Some dark, screeching bit of his mind wants the hellish battle in his cranium back, because while he was waging that war, he was at least sure that he hadn't lost yet. Now the man will never be able to trust his thoughts again. He wonders if the doctor has an implant, if that's why they did this to him. There's no sign that anything abnormal happened, of course, just vague feelings he had during the procedure. He's always been paranoid. Had he always been paranoid? How do we know we've been overwritten if the code is subtle enough? To what extent is advertising or media or society or an ominous feeling of pull controlling us? Is the answer to give to that question our own? How do we know we're not sleeper soldiers for a thing that buried its way through our brainstem? If you can never be sure, why not give in to the demon? Maybe try to steer it a little? See, every glove has resistance. It always, maybe imperceptibly, curls the fingers a certain way. If you don't know whether the pulling controls you, whether you're the glove or the wearer, it's best to pretend like you're both and curl a little. I'm sorry, you say. For what? You already told him that you suck with tension. It's so much easier to just give in fully. Maybe others are wired different, but he obviously never felt it before or he'd know. His whole little story is testament to how little he gets it, so you're sorry. You're still sorry when you pull the trigger and Liam goes wallways. Brief silence. In your head, you count the microseconds before pandemonium. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? Nothing. Still, nothing. You hadn't noticed before, but the entire building is a lot quieter than when you entered. Corridors empty, reception areas empty. The only hint that you weren't alone with Liam from the start is a pink post-it on the entrance. Thank you, Mr. Ashford. And a smiley face. Lettering so neat that it looks printed, and you don't have to have seen her writing to recognize the hand. Man, do you wonder what her play is? Someone way up high has decided to fuck with you. Unpleasant, but not exactly worrying either. Your job in Ruston is done, and you doubt you'll see the consequences.